Since the dawn of civilization, there has been something almost mystical about salt. Empires have risen and fallen because of it. Entire trade routes were carved across deserts and oceans just to possess it. Yet, beyond its value as a preservative or a flavor, salt held a deeper, almost spiritual meaning for ancient cultures. It was never just a mineral. It was a symbol, a reminder of life's essence itself. But why did humanity, across so many ages and lands, see something sacred in something so simple? That question opens a door to a profound reflection that Alan Watts would invite us to walk through. A meditation on how the simplest things, when observed with awakened eyes, reveal the universe's divine rhythm. Alan Watts often spoke about the illusion of separation, the way we divide the sacred from the ordinary, the divine from the material. Salt defies that illusion. It dissolves, merges, becomes part of everything it touches. In its nature, it mirrors the eternal teaching that nothing truly stands alone. Just as salt disappears in the sea, the self disappears in the whole. When we taste it, we are tasting a reminder of unity, of the ocean within our blood, of the tears in our eyes, of the very chemistry that binds us to the earth. To the ancients, salt was not merely a tool, but a teacher. It preserved food, yes, but more importantly, it symbolized the preservation of wisdom, purity, and balance. It was used in rituals not because of superstition, but because it embodied the eternal dance of life and death, the act of giving flavor to existence, even as it dissolves into it. Watts would say that salt, in its quiet simplicity, is a metaphor for the awakened mind, present yet invisible, small yet infinite in its influence. And when we begin to see salt through that lens, the mundane becomes miraculous. Every grain becomes a cosmos in miniature, echoing the insight that the divine is not found in distant heavens, but in the everyday, in what we overlook and what we take for granted. To taste salt consciously is to remember what it means to be alive, to feel, to participate in the sacred act of existence itself. So tonight, as we journey through the forgotten reverence for salt, let's listen not just with our minds, but with our being. Let's allow the words of Alan Watts to dissolve the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred, reminding us, as salt reminds every living thing, that we are not separate from the world, but intimately, beautifully one with it. Alan Watts often reminded us that the human mind tends to create division where none truly exists. We name things, categorize them, and then forget that these boundaries are imaginary. Salt, in this way, is a perfect symbol of the illusion of separateness. Though it appears as countless tiny crystals, once it dissolves, it becomes inseparable from the whole, just as we, with all our identities and fears, dissolve into the vast ocean of being. Watts would say that the sacred nature of salt lies in its surrender, in its effortless return to unity. To watch salt disappear in water is to witness a lesson in humility, that the essence of life is not to hold form, but to flow, to merge, to become one with what is. In ancient times, when people offered salt in rituals, they weren't simply performing superstition. They were participating in a symbolic act of remembrance, the remembrance that all things come from one source, and all things return to it. The offering of salt was a way of saying, I understand the rhythm of life and death. It was a humble acknowledgement of the truth that Watts spoke about so often, that existence is a dance, and we are both the dancer in the dance. Salt, disappearing in the fire or melting in the ocean, mirrors this eternal movement, the ceaseless creation and dissolution that defines the cosmos. When Watts explored the nature of the sacred, he often pointed out how humans have forgotten to see holiness in what is common. We look for God in temples and scriptures, forgetting that divinity hides in the taste of the sea, the scent of rain, the stillness of a mountain. Salt, being everywhere and yet overlooked, becomes a teacher of awareness. It reminds us that the sacred is not rare. It's omnipresent, woven into every molecule of life. To see the sacred in salt is to awaken to the realization that every act, even the simplest, can be an act of devotion when seen through the eyes of presence. There's also a quiet irony in salt's role throughout history. It was once valued as treasure, the origin of the word salary. But as civilizations grew wealthier salt became cheap, invisible, ordinary. And yet, it remained essential, just as the truths Alan Watts spoke of are often ignored precisely because they are too obvious. We are so accustomed to the miracle of existence that we fail to notice it. Salt teaches us to rediscover awe, to find holiness in the mundane, to taste life again with consciousness and gratitude. Perhaps that is why Watts urged us to stop seeking meaning in distant heavens and start tasting life directly. To him, enlightenment was not about escaping the world but fully engaging with it, dissolving, like salt, into the vast experience of being alive. To be one with the universe is not a metaphysical idea. It's a felt experience, available in each breath, each heartbeat, each grain of salt upon the tongue. The sacredness of salt is, ultimately, the sacredness of life itself, silent, simple, and infinite. To truly grasp why salt has been sacred across time, we must understand the ancient mind, a mind that lived in rhythm with nature, not apart from it. In the worldview that Watts often described, ancient people didn't see themselves as separate from their environment. They were participants in a cosmic play. Every storm, every grain, every taste had meaning. Salt, extracted from the sea, represented the eternal link between humanity and the great waters from which all life emerged. When they consumed it, they symbolically returned to their origins. They were not seasoning their food. They were seasoning their awareness with remembrance. Watts taught that modern humanity suffers from a deep amnesia. We have forgotten that we are not observers of life, but expressions of it. Salt, humble and constant, becomes a cure for that forgetfulness. It calls us back to the body, to the senses, to the immediate experience of the present. When you taste salt, you're tasting the same mineral that runs through your blood, that shaped the oceans, that once crystallized on ancient shores millions of years ago. You are tasting the universe's memory. Watts would say that the sacred is not an idea. It is this direct, unmediated contact with what is real, here and now. There is something profoundly human about the way salt bridges opposites, preservation and decay, dryness and moisture, life and death. To preserve is to slow the inevitable, but never to deny it. Salt teaches acceptance, not resistance. Watts would describe it as the art of letting go while participating fully. The sacredness of salt, then, is the sacredness of impermanence. It does not cling to form but participates in the cycle. It preserves what it touches, but never forever. It dissolves, reminding us that all things must pass, and yet nothing is ever truly lost. In this sense, salt becomes a teacher of surrender. Just as it yields to the ocean, we too must yield to the flow of existence. Watts would often laugh at our obsession with control, our desperate attempts to preserve the self, forgetting that the self, like salt, was never meant to remain solid. The moment we dissolve our illusions of permanence, we discover freedom. Salt shows us that to dissolve is not to disappear, but to become part of everything. To surrender is to be infinite. And perhaps that is the deepest reason salt has always been sacred, because it holds within it the paradox that lies at the heart of all spirituality. It is solid, yet vanishes. It is invisible, yet essential. It dies into what it touches, yet gives life to everything. It is the perfect mirror of the human journey, from form to formlessness, from the illusion of separation to the realization of unity. In understanding salt, we begin to understand ourselves, and in understanding ourselves, we rediscover what's called the eternal now, the sacred moment where all things meet and dissolve into one. Alan Watts often said that the greatest illusion of human consciousness is the belief that we are separate observers of a world that exists outside of us. Salt destroys that illusion quietly. The moment it touches water, it vanishes, not in defeat, but in completion. It fulfills its nature by disappearing, by becoming one with what it was always meant to join. And that is precisely the paradox Watts cherished most, that the true purpose of the self is not to stand apart, but to dissolve into the wholeness of being. When we understand that, even the act of dissolving becomes sacred. The salt grain doesn't lose itself in the sea. It realizes itself in the sea. Across ancient civilizations, Salt was used not only in rituals, but also in covenants. When people shared salt, they shared trust, permanence, and unity. To eat salt together was to acknowledge an invisible bond, a vow of truth. Watts would see this as more than symbolism. He would call it an instinctive recognition of our shared essence. When two beings share salt, they are, in essence, remembering that they are made of the same elements, flowing from the same source. Every covenant made with salt was, therefore, a promise not just between individuals, but between fragments of the same consciousness acknowledging each other. There is an elegance in how salt bridges the material and the spiritual. It belongs to both worlds, physical enough to touch, yet mystical enough to represent purity, truth, and eternity. Watts often described the material and spiritual not as separate realms, but as two ways of perceiving the same reality. Salt embodies that teaching perfectly. It doesn't strive to be pure. It simply is. Its purity arises from being what it was meant to be. Unpretentious, essential, whole. In a world obsessed with achieving spiritual perfection, salt whispers the wisdom of being rather than becoming. In the rhythm of life, salt's role is subtle, yet transformative. Without it, food becomes tasteless, yet with too much, it overwhelms. Watts would call this the art of balance, the middle path, the way of moderation and awareness. Salt teaches us how to live without excess or deprivation, how to flavor existence without drowning in it. The right amount of awareness gives life meaning. Too much self-consciousness suffocates it. Just as a pinch of salt brings food to life, a touch of mindfulness brings existence into clarity. And so, when we see salt not as a commodity, but as a cosmic metaphor, we begin to understand the heart of Watts's teachings, that the divine is not hidden in lofty ideas or distant heavens. It is in the taste of salt, in the breath, in the moment itself. Salt's sacredness lies in its ordinariness, in reminding us that the extraordinary is woven into the everyday. When we remember this, we start to live not as seekers of meaning, but as participants in a divine play that is already complete. Watts often laughed when people asked him, "How do I find God?" He would say, "You don't find what was never lost." Salt, in this way, becomes a quiet answer to that eternal question. It is everywhere, in our bodies, our oceans, our tears, and yet we never notice it until we miss its presence. In the same way, the sacred is not something to be found, but to be noticed. Salt teaches us presence, to become aware of what has always been here. Just as you cannot separate the sea from its salt, you cannot separate existence from the sacred. They are one and the same. When Watts spoke of awakening, he described it not as an achievement, but as a realization, a remembering of what we already are. Salt becomes the teacher of that remembering. To the ancients, it was a way to make the invisible visible, to hold in their hands something that connected them to the sea, to life itself. Every time they touched it, they were holding a piece of the infinite. That's the paradox, the eternal, condensed into something that fits between your fingers. Watts would remind us that enlightenment is not about escaping the finite, but embracing it as the doorway to the infinite. Salt's nature also reveals the principle of transformation, another core idea in Watts's philosophy. The same salt that preserves can also purify. The same substance that hardens can also dissolve. This duality mirrors life's own fluid dance between creation and destruction. Watts often spoke about this as the yin and yang of existence, the complementary opposites that sustain balance. Salt embodies that principle perfectly. It preserves what it touches even as it dissolves within it, reminding us that life and death, gain and loss, are not enemies but partners in an eternal rhythm. There is a poetic stillness in that realization. To taste salt consciously is to taste time itself, the oceans of prehistory, the sweat of ancestors, the tears of joy and grief that have shaped humanity. Watts would call this cosmic intimacy, the sense that the entire universe lives within each ordinary experience. Salt, so small and unassuming, carries the weight of eternity. It is proof that the sacred does not announce itself with thunder. It whispers through the ordinary, waiting for us to pay attention. And maybe that's the ultimate message hidden in the ancient reverence for salt, that holiness is not something to be worshipped from afar, but lived from within. What would say that once we awaken to this, life ceases to be a struggle toward meaning and becomes a celebration of being. The grain of salt becomes a symbol of the awakened soul, grounded, simple, but infinite in essence. To taste it is to remember that the divine has never been elsewhere. It has always been here, dissolved in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment that we dare to truly see. In the philosophy of Alan Watts, the sacredness of existence is never confined to what is grand or extraordinary. It resides in the smallest details, the texture of breath, the flicker of light, the taste of salt. He often said that enlightenment is not a distant goal, but an intimacy with the present. Salt, in its simplicity, is a living metaphor for that intimacy. It connects the body to the world, through the blood, through the sea, through the tears. When we truly feel this connection, we begin to see that there is no inside or outside, no me or it. There is only life, expressing itself in countless forms, dissolving and reforming like salt crystals in the tide. Ancient rituals reflected this truth long before it was spoken in words. Priests would scatter salt on altars, travelers would carry it to bless new lands, and families would keep it by their hearths as a symbol of protection and continuity. To them, salt was not magic in the childish sense. It was a recognition of the invisible forces that hold the world together. Watts would describe this as seeing through the game, understanding that symbols and rituals are not about superstition, but about awareness. Salt was never about warding off evil. It was about remembering wholeness, remembering that the sacred has always been interwoven with the material. There's a profound beauty in how something so small carries so much wisdom. Salt does not strive to be noticed. It simply fulfills its purpose, flavoring the world in silence. Watts would say that this is the essence of living harmoniously, acting without ego, without the need for recognition. The salt gives itself completely, yet asks for nothing in return. In this way, it mirrors the ideal of non-attachment that lies at the heart of spiritual understanding. The art of doing without grasping, of giving without expecting, of existing without claiming ownership of existence. When we dissolve a grain of salt in water, we witness a small miracle, form yielding to essence. It is a gesture of trust, a surrender to something larger. Watts taught that surrender is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. It is the realization that control is an illusion, that life is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be experienced. Salt surrenders to the sea and becomes one with it. It does not fight dissolution. It fulfills its destiny through it. Likewise, to live fully, we must dissolve the boundaries that the mind has built, to merge, to feel, to be part of everything. Salt, then, becomes a spiritual mirror. It teaches us to live like it lives, quietly, truthfully, dissolving into the whole while giving meaning to every moment we touch. Watts would say that this is not mysticism, but sanity. To see life this way is to see reality clearly, without the fog of separation. The sacredness of salt is not in its mystery, but in its clarity. It reminds us that the purpose of life is not to seek eternity beyond the horizon, but to taste it here and now, in every grain, in every breath, in every heartbeat that echoes the rhythm of the sea. Alan Watts often spoke of life as music, not a march toward a destination, but a melody meant to be enjoyed in the moment. Salt, in its own quiet way, plays its note in that symphony. It doesn't dominate, it harmonizes. Without it, the flavor of existence feels incomplete. With it, the ordinary becomes divine. Watts would say that salt represents the perfect way to live, in balance, neither trying to control the music nor withdrawing from it, but dancing with it. The sacredness of salt lies in its ability to remind us that life is not something to achieve, but something to savor. The ancients seemed to understand this instinctively. They did not intellectualize salt's meaning. They felt it. They knew that when they tasted it, they were tasting the earth, the ocean, and their own being. In that taste, they found communion, not in words but in presence. Watts would call this the wisdom of direct experience, the kind of knowing that exists beyond logic. It's the knowing of a child who feels wonder without needing to explain it. Salt invites us back to that innocence, to experience the world as if for the first time, without analysis, without division. In our modern world, filled with noise, distraction, and endless striving, we have lost that capacity for simple wonder. We rush past the sacredness hidden in plain sight. We demand transcendence while ignoring the miracles at our fingertips. What would remind us that the sacred does not need to be manufactured? It needs to be remembered. Salt becomes a tool of remembrance. Every time we taste it, it can serve as a meditation, a reminder that life, in all its chaos and flavor, is already enough. It's not something to be conquered, but something to be experienced with reverence. There is a humility in salt that humanity desperately needs. It has power, yet it never boasts. It preserves life, yet it never demands attention. What's admired this kind of humility? The ability to be fully oneself without claiming superiority or control. In a world obsessed with grandeur and achievement, salt teaches the quiet art of being essential without being loud. It shows that the sacred doesn't announce itself with glory. It moves softly, like the tide, shaping everything it touches. So perhaps, when the ancients called salt sacred, they were not worshiping a mineral. They were acknowledging a truth about existence. That truth, which Watts so eloquently translated for the modern mind, is that everything is already divine when seen through the eyes of awareness. Salt is not just a symbol of that awareness. It is that awareness crystallized. To see it dissolve, to taste its presence, is to be reminded that life's meaning is not found in abstraction, but in the tangible, immediate, and profoundly simple miracle of being here at all. Alan Watts often invited his listeners to let go of the compulsion to divide the universe into sacred and profane, because, to him, this division was the root of confusion and suffering. Salt is the perfect bridge between those two illusions. It is not confined to temples or altars, nor to the humble kitchen table. It belongs equally to both. When you sprinkle salt on your meal, you are performing the same gesture that ancient priests once made before sacred fires. The difference lies only in perception. Watts would call this the rediscovery of wonder. The moment we realize that every act of life is holy when performed with awareness. The sacred is not a category. It is a quality of attention. To Watts, the tragedy of the modern age was not the loss of faith, but the loss of reverence. We began to see the world as a machine, as matter without meaning, forgetting that meaning was never something added. It was always there. Salt becomes a cure for that blindness. It reminds us that even the simplest thing can open the doorway to eternity. A single grain, examined closely, reveals the geometry of creation, the hidden order that unites all forms. Watts often compared such realizations to laughter, a sudden, joyful recognition that the divine had been playing hide-and-seek with itself all along. Salt is one of the oldest disguises of the sacred. When we dissolve salt into water, the transformation is invisible yet complete. Watts loved such paradoxes, actions that reveal by disappearing, that teach through silence. Salt never resists its destiny. It embraces it fully, and in doing so, it becomes one with what it touches. This is the heart of spiritual understanding, not resistance, but participation. The universe, Watts would say, is not a war between opposites, but a dance between partners. Salt and water are not enemies. They are lovers in an eternal embrace. To understand this is to move beyond fear, beyond the illusion that losing yourself means death. In truth, it means union. Perhaps this is why salt was once used in blessings and protection rituals. Not because it had power, but because it represented clarity. To scatter salt was to say, let there be awareness. Watts would call it the art of seeing through, of piercing the surface of reality to perceive the infinite beneath. When you see clearly, the ordinary world becomes transparent. You no longer mistake the forms for the formless. Salt, in that sense, is not merely sacred. It is a teacher of perception, showing us how to dissolve the veil between appearance and essence. And so, through something as unassuming as salt, Watts would lead us back to the essence of his philosophy, that enlightenment is not an escape from the world, but an awakening within it. The sacred has never been elsewhere. It has always been here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right kind of attention. Salt doesn't demand to be worshipped. It invites you to taste, to see, to remember. It dissolves so that you might realize what cannot dissolve. The awareness behind it all, eternal and ever-present, like the ocean that holds everything in its depths. If Alan Watts were to stand before us today, holding a handful of salt, he would likely smile before saying a word. He would let the silence do the teaching, because in that silence, you would already understand. He would remind us that salt, like all things, is the universe expressing itself in miniature, a fleeting crystallization of eternity. To treat it as sacred is not to elevate it above other things, but to recognize that everything is sacred. The moment we see that, we stop searching for meaning in the distant and begin to live meaningfully in the present. He would speak of how humans chase divinity through doctrines and dogmas, when divinity has always been hiding in the taste of a tear or the grain that seasons our food. We spend lifetimes trying to escape the ordinary, forgetting that the ordinary is the divine in disguise. Salt, in its quiet wisdom, exposes that folly. It teaches us that holiness is not achieved, it is perceived. The sacred doesn't need to be created, it needs to be noticed. And when it is even the smallest act, eating, breathing, being, becomes an act of worship. In one of his lectures, Watts said that the ocean laughs because it knows that every wave, though it rises and falls, is still the ocean. Salt is the laughter of the sea crystallized. It carries that cosmic humor within it, the gentle reminder that we, too, are not separate from the source. We rise, we fall, we dissolve, and yet the ocean of being remains. To taste salt is to taste the sea within yourself, to remember that your life is not a lonely flame, but a spark of the infinite dance that never ends. That is why salt has always been sacred, not because it performs miracles, but because it reveals one. It is a whisper from the universe saying, "You are part of me." Every civilization that honored salt was, in truth, honoring that message. Watts would call it the simplest revelation of all, that the divine is not something to be believed, but something to be lived, tasted, felt, and known directly. Salt, humble and eternal, is the messenger of that knowing. And so, as the ancients did, let us hold this symbol of simplicity with reverence, not as an object of worship, but as a mirror. For in salt's quiet dissolution lies the story of every being, the story of return. The grain disappears, but its essence lives on in the sea. We, too, dissolve into the infinite, not in loss, but in fulfillment. As Alan Watts would say, you are the universe playing hide and seek with itself. And perhaps, in the sacred taste of salt, the game finally ends, because the seeker and the sought become one. In the end, what Alan Watts taught us, and what salt quietly demonstrates, is that the sacred is not something rare or distant. It is woven into the very fabric of life, hidden in the ordinary, waiting to be recognized. A grain of salt carries the wisdom of the sea, the memory of the earth, and the reflection of unity that connects all things. It dissolves to fulfill its purpose, reminding us that we, too, are meant to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into everything. To live in awareness is to taste this truth, to recognize that even the smallest acts can hold infinite meaning when approached with presence. Salt teaches us that surrender is not the end, but the beginning of wholeness. When it merges with the ocean, it does not lose itself. It becomes more than it ever was. Watts would say that this is the essence of enlightenment, to let go of the illusion of control and become one with the flow of existence. The sacredness of salt lies in its willingness to vanish, in its humble participation in the great cycle. It invites us to do the same, to release the boundaries of ego and rediscover our place within the boundless rhythm of life. As we reflect on this, the question is not whether salt is sacred, but whether we still have eyes to see the sacred everywhere. Watts would remind us that the divine never left. Only our awareness did. The world has always been shimmering with meaning, but we've been too busy searching for it to notice. Every breath, every heartbeat, every grain of salt becomes a chance to remember, to see the infinite in the finite, the timeless in the temporary. This realization doesn't change the world. It transforms the way we see it. So perhaps the next time you taste salt on your lips, in your food, or in your tears, pause for a moment. Feel its story unfolding within you. The sea, the stars, the endless cycle of life returning to itself. Let it remind you that everything you touch, and everything that touches you, is part of the same sacred continuum. To recognize this is to awaken, not to another world, but to this one, fully alive, fully divine, and already complete. If this reflection stirred something within you, if it reminded you of life's quiet miracles, then stay close. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let this space become a sanctuary for deeper understanding. Each conversation, each reflection, is another grain dissolving into the ocean of awareness we're creating together. After all, the journey of awakening is never walked alone. It's shared, felt, and lived, moment by sacred moment.